Good afternoon. Welcome to today's forum. My name is Arden, and I'm a forum host here at the Hinckley Institute of Politics. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is a roundtable discussing ontological security in global politics. This event is sponsored by the Department of Political Science and the student-run Policy and Diplomacy Society. It is presented as part of the Wormuth Endowed Lecture Series. This endowment makes possible symposia, lectures, and initiatives that are at the intersection of international and American politics. We want to thank Professor Brent Steele, the Francis D. Wormuth Presidential Chair, for his leadership on this event. Now I'm excited to introduce today's speakers. Katrina Kinvall is the professor at the Department of Political Science, Lund University, Sweden. Her research interests involve political psychology and international relations with a particular focus on emotions, gender, migration, and populism in Europe and South Asia. Her work in ontological security began with an article in the journal Political Psychology in 2004 and a book published by Routledge in 2007 titled Globalization and Religious Nationalism in India: The Search for Ontological Security. Jennifer Mitzen, PhD at the University of Chicago, is professor of political science at The Ohio State University, with research and teaching interests in international relations theory, global governance, and international history. She is the author of Power in Concert, the 19th Century Origins of Global Governance, published by the University of Chicago Press 2013. Her work in ontological security is prolific, beginning with 2 articles published in 2006 in the Journal of European Public Policy and the European Journal of International Relations. Brent Steele is a Francis D. Wormuth Presidential Chair and Professor of Political Science here at the University of Utah. He teaches courses on international relations, U.S. foreign policy, and international ethics. His work in ontological security began with an article in 2005 and a book published by Routledge in 2008 titled Ontological Security in International Relations. Today's roundtable will be facilitated by Chase Perry. Chase is a student here at the University of Utah studying political science, international studies, and Kwamo. I'll turn it over to him to get started, but first, join me in welcoming our guests.
All right. Thank you all for being here again. Thank you, Arden, for the introduction. And let's start off with the main question: what is ontological security, both generally and what does it mean to you in your fields of study?
Oh, I have to go first.
You have to go first.
Well, thank you all for being here. Thanks to the Hinckley Institute. Thanks, Chase. Thanks, Arden, for the very kind introductions. Well, we can just start with the way in which we're defining it and or explaining it, I guess. In the abstract for this roundtable, it's the need for a feeling of personal continuity and order through time and space. Sometimes it's considered to be the ways in which you securitize the self or securitize a particular subject if it's beyond the self. So the way in which we can know who or what we are in order to go forward in social spaces, everyday engagements, so on and so forth. That's what it's defined at the individual level, and then we can talk a little bit more about how that manifests itself in different drives for ontological security at other levels of the subject. So that's how I would start the conversation.
Yeah, and I can just continue there. I mean, what we often think about is, the kind of search for a kind of homogeneous self or homogeneous identity, So when we think of ourselves as kind of national identity, or that we close out, other ways of defining this identity. So ontological security in that sense, makes us resort a lot to a very singular way of looking at ourselves and our surroundings. I think that's what I would just say to start with.
Thanks, and it's great that you guys all are here, so thanks so much for coming. The only thing I would add to those great introductions is that often, especially in IR, if you take a lot of IR, you think of security in what we would call physical terms, the territory, the borders of the state. If those are crossed and penetrated, then you're suddenly insecure. And ontological security shifts the focus from the physical to the sense of self, right? The identity and the state as something that whose physical borders may change, whose physical borders may be pierced, but as long as the sense of who the state is can remain constant, then you could say that the state is has ontological, even if not physical, security. So the juxtaposition is really important.
Awesome, thank you. I also want to ask, you guys have done a lot of pioneering work in the field of IR with ontological security. What makes it translate so well from its original home in sociology and psychology into the realms of political science and international relations?
You want me to start again?
Yeah, you
Sure.
Of course.
Path dependent. Well, I mean, for me, it started with a dissatisfaction, going back to what Professor Mitson just mentioned, with our understanding of security in international relations. I just didn't see it empirically in a lot of the things that I was studying and investigating and researching. And so getting back to the distinction between physical and ontological insecurity, the analogy that I always drew in terms of what I was seeing in the discourses, narratives, discussions, debates in the first case that I looked at, which was Great Britain during the US Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. Great Britain's a hegemon. Great Britain should feel like it's very physically secure. It had command of the sea. It was a naval power. It was an empire. So it should have felt physically secure looking on as the United States was tearing itself apart, the North versus the South. And in fact, even more physically secure because the United States looked like it was becoming its main rival as a rising power in the 19th century. It had all the material benefits of what it then would utilize to become its own hegemon in the middle of the 19th century. So Britain had an interest, a physical security interest, to see it tear itself apart. But then if you look at all the parliamentary debates that are happening in the mid-19th century in Britain, they're really upset, kind of, and uncomfortable. And nowadays we'd call it, in the vernacular of ontological security, they're anxious about what's going on in the United States, not just because the Civil War is bloody, but because of what it is about. And so when the Emancipation Proclamation gets issued by Lincoln, and the preliminary one in fall of 1862, and then becomes the force of law in 1863, and that makes that Civil War about slavery, Britain no longer considers intervening whatsoever to either help the South or recognize the Confederacy as its own nation state. And so the analogy that I draw is that when we talk about states as insecure, at least back then, 20, 25 years ago, we're talking about them as being, trying to secure their borders or trying to become more powerful physically. But when we talk about individuals, like an individual is insecure, that's just a different understanding. And you actually see states that have that kind of insecurity, sometimes even more than the physical insecurity that we often assume to be the only drive that they had out there. That's what I was interested in. And then I kind of just developed it from there.
Yeah, I mean, I come to it from a little different perspective. But I think one of the things that, with the focus on, for me it was very important to open up the state. What is happening within the state, and then, so to be able to understand state relations, we also need to understand what are those when we think about the state acts in a certain way, state acts emotionally, what are we actually talking about then? So to me, it was always a way of, we're looking for something that could kind of understand this linkage between when we ascribe something to state and the linkage between when we ascribe that to individuals and being anxious, so the ontological security concept in that sense, I think opens up, this kind of, I guess more realist understanding of the state as being, kind of this billiard ball almost, like a model kind of thing. So I think that's one of the things. And I think the other thing for me has been that if we are interested, that's why I go back to Giddens in some sense, because what Giddens is interested in is modernity. What does modernity do to people? But not only what does modernity do to people, what does modernity do to groups? What does it do to states, perhaps, the kind of neoliberal order? What does that do to people? And so to me, I've translated that into what does globalization do to people? I think at the bottom of it is rapid change. What does rapid change do? When you no longer have the kind of established traditions, orders of society, and that's under flux. We can talk about risk society, we can talk about liquid society, we can talk about all these different words. And to be able to kind of, to be able to understand this rapid change, we need something that actually brings together, I think, the more psychological dimension with the sociological, with the political dimension. And that's what I would say about traveling from, and this is what we call about level of analysis, of course, how we can, in some sense, talk about the state without committing some kind of psychological reductionism. And to be able to do that, we first have to problematize this entity on a kind of psychological and sociological level. So I think that's what I would start off.
Going back to the not problematizing the state level, which is where I started until I met Katerina. What was the question again? What got us there? Why does it translate so well? Yep. I remember now. Well, what I was thinking a lot about is, and you can see it if you look at the piece I wrote that got published in 2006, is long-standing conflict as a source of identity. Why do people stay in relationships that suck, that are so bad? And then you look at international politics and you see states in relation to one another that seem to define themselves off the conflict, right? So the conflict lasts a lot longer. I mean, just think Israel-Palestine. And then I think of some of the first folks to reach out to me after publishing that article, which I was hoping would help give shed some light on why states stay in conflictual relations for so long when a realist approach would tell us that conflict should end. It's Israelis, it's Iranians, Chinese scholars, and Serbian scholars. And so you think like these are states and groups that are in longstanding conflicts that you could see become a source of identity and identification. And to break out of that conflict, you need to understand what causes the attachment to the conflict in the first place. And since I read psychoanalytic stuff and object relations for fun, that was sort of the link for me was seeing that stuff that I like to read about in interpersonal relations, and I could see it so much in world politics.
Awesome, thank you. All right, I wanted to ask today, modern day 2024, what do you guys feel are the main focuses of ontological security in international relations? What's the relevant, what's the hype, and how are those different from the study of other isms within international relations today?
Oh, back to me. Well, I won't steal their thunder, especially Katerina's, but it's definitely being utilized over and over and over again because of particular emotions that are relevant to politically urgent topics. And so Professor Schinval is centrally focused, especially on engaging populism and different forms of populisms. And so I'll let her talk about that if that was going to be one of the areas that she was going to talk about. I mean, not to be like just really brash or arrogant, but I actually think there's no part of world politics, global politics nowadays that can't be at least reconstructed and understood a little bit better through ontological security. I mean, for me, I'm still thinking about, even though we're all supposed to forget it, the pandemic. I mean, you could just see it everywhere during the pandemic. So there were all these not all these studies, but quite a few studies that would come out talking about and understanding what was going on during the pandemic. And a central referent in ontological security studies, a couple of them, would be anxiety and then also routines. And so why did people feel anxious? It wasn't necessarily because of the physical threat of COVID, but it was the anxiety that it generated, both because the pandemic pulls us out of our old routines and then maybe forces us to think about new routines. And one way to resolve anxiety is not just through routines, but to objectify it, because anxiety is kind of a general state of unease, whereas fear is something where we have a definite object. The problem with a hidden virus is that it isn't right there to definitely define and fear. It's more we're anxious about it. So what did we do? A lot of us, missed our old routines, but we developed new ones, maybe even healthy routines, like puzzles and taking walks with our family and hanging out with our dogs and baking. Everybody was baking bread. And then there are other people that miss their old routines so much that they just like went out and protested because they wanted to go back to their jobs, but probably not. They really wanted to go to Applebee's again, and they wanted to go to Chili's again, and those kinds of things. Or they wanted to go to church again. So they miss their old routines. How do we handle it on a societal level? Well, the United States had jet flyovers. What did that have to do with COVID? I don't know, but it's what the United States' previous routine and ritual was at football games and all these other things in terms of showing solidarity and patriotism. So let's do the same thing, except instead of flying over Rice-Eccles Stadium, we'll fly over the hospital with the jet flyover. Some of you might have been here when that happened. All of those things can be understood in terms of ontological security. And then the only other thing is the war in Ukraine and Russia's invasion. I mean, it has implications for how to resolve it that is not about physical security for Putin. He tries to invoke physical security all the time and say that it was Big Bag NATO and their expansion 25 years ago that then forced him to invade Ukraine. No, it's about ontologically what Russia sees itself as and what Putin sees Russia as denying the existence of Ukraine. And so ontologically, Russia is going to incorporate Ukraine into a greater Russia, and that's it. And if that's the case, the resolution isn't going to be very clean either. Those are a couple of the things I'd throw out there as being really usefully understood through ontological security.
And I can continue there. I mean, I think what Brent is saying, I mean, when we look at, what areas have people written about now lately, and if you think about, the Ukrainian war, it's a lot about a sense of loss. And that's also true when it comes to, another area, which is nationalism, populism, bringing back something that we thought existed in the past, which, of course, perhaps never was true in the first place. So for Putin, for instance, it's not so much about bringing back the Soviet Union. It's about bringing back the Tsar Empire, So it's looking back into time, and it's romanticizing these kind of nostalgic past. And the same thing we see in all populist, nationalist language. It's often about, thinking that, America in the 1950s used to be this place where, women were real men, women were real women, men were real men. There's also this kind of masculinist element into ontological security as well. So I think that points to some of the areas, I think, where people have been publishing. More generally, I would say that people are publishing in areas related to crisis. And crisis can be many things. We can talk about climate crisis. There's been literature now on ontological security and climate crisis. We can talk about crisis of the liberal state. I mean, so that's also what people are writing on then. So things that kind of emphasize. So these crises have been different over time. So right now we are talking about conflicts. We're talking about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. We're talking about the war in Gaza. We're talking about Ukraine. We're talking about these crises. And then to think them through an ontological security lens, I think puts emphasis on how, especially political leaders, motivate and justify, their wars, for instance, and how they do it by often emphasizing this kind of need to belong, the desire for belonging, this desire for the past, the kind of memorialization of something that perhaps existed or not in the past. So I think that's why you see, so if you start looking at what's being published, it's often published in relation to these crises we see around us. And these can be many different crises. And they can be on the state level, they can be on the, interstate level, they can be on the national level. But I think when we talk about ontological security, this is where you see the literature coming out right now. Yeah.
Repeat the question again. I've been listening to everything they've been saying and wondering if there's anything more to say. So can you repeat the question?
So what are the main focuses of ontological security today, and how is that perhaps different from some of the other isms that are being studied?
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I think that Brent and Katerina have covered so much, and I want to reiterate what Brent started with by saying that it's, narcissistically enough, I see it everywhere. I think it's relevant to everything. But one thing I think I could add is taking it to the personal. So as he was talking about COVID, I was thinking about what it felt like being home with my kids 24/7 in that patch of time. And I won't talk about all the dimensions of it, but when I started, a particular instance made me think a lot about something that then is reverberated into the current stuff I'm working on, the relationship between international order and our individual subjectivity in our day-to-day life. And it was really during, our kids were online constantly, and there were, one day my son came down, and he's on the autism spectrum, so everything is very black and white. He came down, and he's like, okay, we're playing, I don't know, some game. And he's like, my friends now say, oh, wow, that's so Hitler, as being something that like is a really cool thing that they do in one of these violent games. And he's like, Mom, is that a good thing? So we had to have, a conversation about that. And then he had an assignment from school on leadership where they had to pick a leader to research, and then they were going to compare the leaders. And there was Abraham Lincoln, and there was TR, and there was, other folks, and there was Stalin, and there was Hitler on it. And so once again, we have that dinner table conversation, and it really, what I noticed is that he saw in that first case the friendship differently, right? He saw his friendship differently when somebody was admiring something, and then he also was wondering about what he was. It was just a very insecurity making thing, and he seemed to really kind of grapple with how to think about things he had really taken for granted and no longer could, or no longer felt comfortable, or it shaped the way he was thinking about friendship. And it made me think, like, we don't usually think about the histories we learn as we're growing up in at least, in our public schools and all of that, as being aspects of ourself or incorporated into ourself and our day-to-day concepts of friendship and so on. But it really struck me that, the narratives of the post-war liberal order are internalized as part of how we then go about living our life day to day. And that is intimately connected for me, to start to think about questions of international order and deeply our day-to-day constitution itself. So,
thank you. Yeah. I want to build off that. Professor Schinwald and Steele, what do you think are some of the broader or even moral implications of personalizing or humanizing international relations through the field of ontological security?
Well, I mean, one of the ethical, or I guess political critiques of ontological security as applied to collectives is that you don't problematize the state, that there are issues with jumping levels, or that by focusing on one particular subject, the drive for ontological security at the state level, we're forgetting the human cost to that and who gets included and excluded. So the issues of community that are part of ontological security drives. What is a community and then what is not is something that I think has been out there and is important. But then, for me, one of the things I was thinking about in the late 2010s with some work with Jonas Subotic was some work on moral injury. We developed a little bit of this related concept in ontological security studies to anxiety that we called ethical anxiety. Well, what is ethical anxiety? But I think it has important ethical implications. That's why I bring it up. One of the ways in which we resolve anxiety is through routines. But sometimes we can have very routinized, very orderly, everyday existences, very routinized, everyday patterns of behavior, but feel very ethically uncomfortable because of the moral universe around us. And that kind of goes back to the personal that Professor Mitzen was talking about. I mean, for me, for instance, I'm a privileged white dude. I have a good job. I have a really safe community overall that I live in. We got pollution, but overall, it's fairly safe. But I can then also be in a world, in a community, in a country where kids are getting gunned down at school every day, and there's climate change, and there's violence, and there's, I have routines where I'm not going to get pulled over, but I know that because of the color of their skin, other individuals within my community will. And so I can have a very orderly existence, but feel very ethically anxious. And I think then that's both a problem, but it's also an opportunity. And that means that I can think about the ways in which I can change my own routines or call for society to change its own routines so that I no longer feel anxious, but I no longer also feel ethically anxious. That's one ethical way in which we can think about the importance and the politics of routines, because routines are never just individual, they're also societal as well. That'd be one way I'd answer it.
And routines, of course, often traditions.
That's right.
That can be more or less repressive or oppressive or liberal or so I think that's one way of thinking about it is for a routine. I was thinking about it in relation to your other question that you asked before that we didn't actually answer, how it relates to other isms. Because one of the things in ontological security studies, and we have chosen the word studies rather than an ism or a theory or is that they all many people who write within ontological security studies relate to the different isms in different ways. So some of them are writing in relation to realism and liberalism, some of them are writing in relation to constructivism, some of them are writing in relation to post-structuralism and to post-colonialism, to gender studies, feminism. And I think, so the debates you already have in these other isms, when it comes to the kind of ethical level, you will have those debates in ontological security studies as well. So I think what parts of ontological security studies perhaps does or can do by focusing in some sense on insecurity, because for me insecurity is actually more interesting than security. So insecurity is whose insecurity and what are those patterns of the structures of society that creates insecurity, and how can we understand that insecurity in relation to the state, for instance, or in relation to the group, or in relation to those norms and values of those different groups that perhaps sometimes can be very repressive. And you need perhaps help from other fields like post-colonial studies, like gender studies, because that's when you also point to these structures of power that are part of understanding ontological security. So to me, we cannot discuss it in isolation because it's always in relation to these other theoretical perspectives. And ontological security, by emphasizing in some sense some of the emotional but also unconscious level, I work a lot on psychoanalysis and Lacan especially, we emphasize also, what is it that makes, people, groups, states act and feel. Not to say that states can feel in the same sense, but to say that at least we can try to understand those kind of emotions. And then that also, of course, has a moral obligation. Within that is like what the state or the group or the individual does can be ethical in different ways. So I think it's to be able to try to understand that. And some of us have a very normative agenda as well, So that's, it depends a little bit on where we come from, I guess.
I'm not getting it again.
It's okay. I leave it.
I wanted to ask about the criticisms of ontological security. You guys have, back to your pioneering work, done a lot of research, a lot of writing, a lot of discussion on this subject. What are some of the criticisms you've received, and how do you address this sort of, I don't want to say atypical approach in international relations, but perhaps a different approach than what's been tried and true over the past 200 years of scholarship in international relations?
I'll let Professor Mitson take that.
Well, I can answer, I guess I'd be answering more in a disciplinary way than an intellectual way. But the criticisms you can see by the fact that it took, 6 years to publish that piece. So they're all dealt with in hard-won, bloody paragraphs. The criticisms I had in the community I was working with were that, isn't this just isn't this just motivated bias? Isn't this real resistance to accepting that there could be something like an attachment that we could talk about in international politics, that states could be attached to something, that we could talk about states with using social theory, despite the fact that everybody talks about them in rational choice terms. Suddenly that was the end of social theory for most people. So convincing people that rational choice is actually a social theory and not just the way the world works was a big, heavy lift. And then working with just trying to make it okay to think about the word attachment, which felt very unmasculine to the community that I was in. I guess I'll just start there and let you guys take it.
Go ahead.
I mean, just some of the criticism. I mean, it is, if security is kind of the ultimate purpose people strive for. I mean, this is one of the questioning. I mean, are there other things that people or group thinks about than their own security? That's been one of the criticism. The other criticism is, like Jennifer was talking about, the level of analysis. Can we ascribe the same thing to the state as we can to individuals and groups? Leaving out, in some sense, some people argue that ontological security is based in itself on a kind of Western notion of what security is, Western white, and so there is big critique from, gender studies, post-colonial studies, race theory, for kind of some ignoring some of those power structures that go on when people don't seek the same kind of security, because they are in position in different kind of security structures depending on where they are in society and where they are in the world. So those are some of the critiques, and I think a lot of people then have been writing about it. I think one critique that I find is, there is, within ontological security studies, it is the strive perhaps for closing down identity. We close down national identity. We close down, various forms of identity. And I think part of the early ontological security literature was actually trying to, this was what we were seeing empirically. So we tried to understand it, but it wasn't a thing that we argue that it was a good thing, And I think there has been a misunderstanding that some of the critics have come and say that we argue in favor of kind of a homogeneous closing down of identity. And I don't think that was so true. So I think there was an empirical critique that wasn't really relevant in a sense of how it was written. But yeah, that's some of the critiques we had.
And the additional thing is when there is a concern that ontological security is based on westernized assumptions, there's also a temporal historical element to that. Before you have modernity, because so much of, especially Giddens's sociology is based on like looking at what he calls high modernity, or we would call late modernity, and all of these features of it, and that ontological security can be a challenge, a struggle within that context, but there are all these features that develop to provide us ontological security, to prevent anxiety and so on and so forth. But what was the self like? Was there even a self? Was there even anxiety before modernity? So if that's the case, it's not just a Western, but is it a modern bias? And if that's the case, can we actually study anything before modernity? Because international relations, historical international relations, definitely wants to study long before modernity. So those kinds of questions, those are the ones that I kind of enjoy. I like, this notion of, okay, that's a challenge. Let's go see if we can find something that's out there that would relate to a pre-modern context of, if not a self, a striving for something like a self, or a different understanding of ontological security that goes beyond or breaks out of just our understanding nowadays of the self.
I can just add there also, I mean, there is the whole, whether self is something foundational, something autonomous. I mean, that's also the critique on Western, or whether self itself is socially constructed. Where, so there is this whole debate that you have between, positivism, post-positivism, also in ontological security studies. So that's a debate that's going on. It's foundational or anti-foundational in some sense. So that's another debate, I think.
Awesome. I've got 1 or 2 more questions. We're coming up past the halfway mark. Gen Z has been perhaps described as one of the most anxious generations in history. We have divisive politics. We've grown up with COVID, with repeated economic disasters, there isn't exactly a sense of continuity for a lot of students our age's lives. And imagining the future is difficult given the amount of upheaval and social change going on right now. How would you describe that, and what kind of words of encouragement would you give students in thinking about that issue?
Or words of caution. Old man yells at clouds, words of caution. I mean, that's a great point. I mean, there is so in ontological security terms, one of the concepts that is used to understand crisis at both an individual and societal level is this phrase of critical situations. They are these situations that are of a radically unpredictable kind. Because if we could predict them, then we could prevent feeling sort of insecure over them or anxious over them. So wars, terrorist attacks, climate catastrophes, mass casualty events. Those are the kinds of things that you can't predict. If you could predict them, then you could do something about them and prepare for them and adapt to them and become more resilient to them. But because you can't, that's what shatters, not just necessarily you physically, but ontologically. I think where you're going, Chase, with that is that maybe those are happening more quickly. In generational analysis, the argument has always been that the critical situation is usually during your formative experiences, and then you relive that formative experience the rest of your life and put everything within there. But that also assumes that you can stabilize enough in light of that formative experience to be able to figure out routines and ways of thinking and ways of doing so that you don't have to experience that again. Even if that blinds you to other formative experiences and critical situations for emerging generations. The concern with Gen Z is that every day is a critical situation. The word of caution I would have, and not necessarily encouragement, the word of encouragement would be others have experienced that, and that's just part of it, and you will work your way through, right? You will find ways to go on and work your way through it overall. The word of caution is that some of the devices that you definitely see in late modernity or nowadays in the 2010s and 2020s, and it's not just unique to that, but it's much more quickly advancing in that direction, is one of the ways in which to handle ontological insecurity is this other related concept that I've done some work on with Chris Browning and Purti Joanimi of vicarious identity, vicarious experience, vicarious identification. And so much of what Gen Z experiences, in order to resolve the daily sort of insecurities of what's around them, is to vicariously seek out another proxy and have those experiences that should provide ontological security if your daily experience is one constituted by ontological insecurity. The problem is then when you're living the self through another, which is what vicarious identity is, sometimes that can create insecurity as well. A lot of times it does. And especially if you have too many sources of potential vicarious identification. So it's just a word of caution that mediated experiences, social media or other forms, are not going to necessarily resolve that either.
I mean, it's a big question, and I'm not at all sure how to respond to it. But I mean, in theoretical terms, there are, so one of the things that ontological security studies, show is, why is it that we sometimes attach ourselves to certain narratives, and narratives that kind of close down identity, being American, being Swedish or something, that. And how can we, in some sense, and how, especially how, I mean, I'm looking a lot at populist, far-right populist authoritarian leaders, that they kind of are able to provide, simple answers to complex questions, and they do it often through these emotional narratives. So one of the questions then for me, and I guess for this generation, is, how can we, in some sense, how can we deconstruct that? How can we see that this is actually just playing to these insecurities and fears among individuals, that they strive for kind of a homogeneous identity. And some people say that the answer is to, we have to learn to dwell in ambivalence, as John Cash is talking about, that we have to stop kind of striving for, one form of identity, instead of recognizing that everything is intersectional, that there is no such thing as a identity, And I think that's part of it, in some sense, is to, find that these answers and narratives that are provided to people and who play on emotions and insecurities, that, they need to be, they need to be shown in their fullness, in a sense, to show how limited they are, because all they do is closing down. They don't open up. They don't open up for other ways of thinking identity or the relationship between self and identity. That doesn't really provide an answer, but I think it's part of what has to be confronted to some extent.
I was going to bring in the term dwell in ambivalence, and I'm casting about to find something else to introduce. But so I guess I'll just bring it down to the personal, since I have two Gen Z kids. Mm-hmm. it is, in a sort of everyday sense, developing a kind of subjectivity that can dwell in ambivalence, that can hold on to two different things at the same time, to the I know who I am, and the world is changing. How do I make a way for myself in a world that's constantly changing? So how do I deal with the fact that he's my friend and he talks this way and is, lives that kind of a life, and just kind of finding the home is, I guess, where I go to, the sense of home, where which is not always just a physical, or not reducible to a physical space, but the idea that there is a place and there's a set of relationships in which you feel at home enough to handle the deep uncertainties that you're constantly facing. That's what I would add.
Got about 15, 20 minutes left. Do we want to have any student questions?
Right before we do that, can we ask you why you're interested in ontological security, and then start taking it? Sorry, you're the chair, so you call it. But
Yeah. I think number one started out in our international ethics class still. The sense of that every policy decision is individual. Every time we have a big data set, or every time that we have a large generalization within these fields of studies, especially as undergrads, that everything is so clean and so organized to try and teach us how to learn, it can be a bit dehumanizing to realize that everything behind what we learn is based on individuals, is based on what people have learned before us, written before us, and especially experienced before us. And so thinking about thinking and how others think and others perceive the world, I think is something that is always a worthwhile practice. Because whatever we do in our lives, if it's involved in government, if it's involved in policy, if it's involved in corporate, anything that we study, we have to ground ourselves and realize that other people have valid human experiences, and the way that we think is just as valid as a method of viewing the world, as a method of connecting with others, in order to heighten our awareness of the world around us, but also to engage in study and scholarship. That would be my answer to that. Now, any student questions? Arden, you have the microphone.
Yeah, I'll bring the mic over to you, and then we'll do a question up here first.
Hello, thank you for coming. My name is Alex. I'm a student here. So, for instance, Mearsheimer's idea of balance of power will tell us that the West has been poking at the East, therefore Russia, needed to balance the powers and become like the regional hegemon again, and all these type of things, right? And then Gilpin will tell us that the regional hegemony stability theory would be that the East will be safer if Russia becomes and remains as the regional hegemon. Now, how would ontology security relate to this kind of theories, and how would it be important in international relations, and how would this idea help us explain, just to let it set? Just because a lot of the concepts are not necessarily super there for me after hearing you guys speak. How does this help us understand conflicts in international relations or other conflicts? I did hear you say that it is because of this kind of notion of the past, and about how this is how big and how great Russia was, and how they want to be big and great again. However, how does this relate to international relationships, and why is it important to us studying this type of conflicts?
So if I could just start really quickly, because I had mentioned in passing this idea, which Mearsheimer has put out there quite a bit, of NATO enlargement making Russia insecure in the 1990s, and then that later on becoming the core reason that Russia is still insecure. And you see a lot of those types of realists making that kind of argument. Ontological security comes from structure, and one of the sort of resources for ontological security studies is Giddens's structuration theory, which talks about both agents and structures. And this would be another way to re-answer Chase's question about Gen Z. It's not always about structure. It's not always about, but realists only see structure. They don't see agents, and they do not see agency. So why did NATO enlarge, right? Jelena Subotic has this great essay in light of the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, where she says, it's not that NATO came over and just shoved all these small countries into NATO. Those countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union wanted to be in NATO. And they had to do a bunch of things that cost them a lot of time and energy and restructuring. Because of their own agency, they wanted to be in NATO because they didn't want to be Ukraine in 2022 all the way back in the 1990s. And so where the realists see nothing but structure, they ignore agency. And they ignore the importance of agency. And they ignore the possibilities of agency within structures. And that the structures are never separate from that agency either. That the structures are there because of the collections of agents that put them there. And then they can reform them as well. That would be one answer to that.
I mean, to me, it depends on what you mean with international relations to start with. You know, so I think, you know, doing IR in a European setting is quite a different experience from doing IR in an American setting. And so I think, you know, I mean, ontological security studies for me has also grown out of a more kind of European tradition or continental tradition of kind of a more post-structuralist, post-positivist, feminist kind of way of looking at the world. And in that sense, perhaps not trying to, you know, come into IR from a little different perspective, because IR in itself is not so preoccupied with the free debates or the, you know, realism, liberalism, constructivism, but actually has turned it around at a much earlier stage. So I think it depends. I mean, your question in some sense says that IR is something particular, you know, and I think IR can be so many different things, you know, depending on, again, which ism you come to from and who you want to engage in that particular spectrum. So I would say I would be more interested, I guess, understanding, you know, Russia's foreign policy or the war in Ukraine. I mean, from an ontological security perspective, I think it would just explain and make us understand better Putin and why he acts than perhaps coming from, you know, these traditional perspectives. That's not to say that they don't say anything, but they say something differently. So I think ontological security studies can give another dimension for understanding, you know, the way that Putin goes into, you know, understanding. And you have to understand his rationale also. I mean, his rationale is closely connected to, you know, anti-gay propaganda. I mean, there's so much in there we can't understand by just looking at this from a state perspective and Putin as kind of isolated from his context. So that's what I would say would depend on, you know, where we come from. Yeah.
All right, a few things. I guess to build on what Katrina just said, I mean, you can take an ontological security lens and get a deeper explanation to a lot of things that John says. And I think he would agree. One way to talk about it, again, building on what Katrina just said, is like, how do you understand Putin's turn to the greater Russia without thinking about this loss of great power identity or a fear of loss of great power self-identity because of changes in the system since end of the Cold War? Right, so the turn to going for greater Russia could be understood more deeply from an onto security perspective. Another kind of neat way to think about it would be look at how much Russians love Mearsheimer's argument, right? Look at the position that he has in the Russian discourse right now, and why do they love this argument so much? There's a certain Cold War nostalgia. I mean, right, to this NATO versus Russia and on our, you know, just let's go back to the familiar narratives of self and other and how the world works in order to go on and get by in a very different kind of world. Oh my God, let's bring Mearsheimer in because he's telling us that's the way the world still works, right? So I think that's one way to see it.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we'll go to a question right back here.
Hi, my question for you guys is, would you agree or disagree that issues of ontological security are driven largely by state governments or divisive individuals, certain political figures. I mean, specifically when we think of Russia, Ukraine, right? One of the justifications Putin used for going into Ukraine, going to Crimea, was that Russian-speaking peoples there were under threat. But when you talk to the Russian people there, when you do interviews, when you phone in and ask them about, how do you feel about the situation going on in Ukraine, it doesn't seem to translate because they seem rather disconnected from what's going on there. And I think that's largely due to the fact that Russian media is largely controlled, and what they hear and see is kind of filtered. And then also, when you think about what's going on here with Trump and how him and his camp are claiming, illegal immigrants are destabilizing the country and stuff like that. They're stealing jobs, they're, crime and stuff like that. But when you look at like the economics here, the jobs, stuff like that also doesn't really translate. So it seems like it's really kind of this tool used by governments to claim, hey, things are not going well. But the local populace, it seems like a different story.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think one thing we haven't talked so much, it is, how the state becomes an ontological security provider to its population. And how by emphasizing, by closing down this kind of nationalist space, and who is an insider, who is an outsider, who is entitled to this nation and who is not. And I think that's what brings together all these kind of populist authoritarian leaders, and being able to, that is what they are trying to do again and again and again. So it is, constantly notice self and other, who is belonging to this nation state and who is not belonging to it. So I think, if we look at that, I don't think that's the only thing ontological security does, but I think it's something that we need to look at. How does the state, or how does certain political leaders, what are the kind of narratives, what are the divisions they are using to close down identity and bring this kind of ontological security to its people or parts of its people, and how that's being done. And it's almost exclusively being done in relation to self and other, that somebody else is othered, somebody who is not have those kind of, and that can be an internal other, it can be, we've seen that in, kind of gender conflicts, race conflicts. I mean, that it can also be an external other. Those immigrants, they come as, and it's a language used also. I mean, we look at the Brexit language, by Farage, talking about hordes of immigrants coming into the UK, and then motivating that for Brexit, so be able to, close down what it means to be British and Britishness in itself. So I think, for me, that's what I'm interested in. It is that kind of how does then these kind of political leaders, how are they able to use, what kind of narratives are they using, what kind of stories are they telling to make people believe? What is the emotional attachment between those people who are supposed to vote for them and the political leaders, and how do they create these emotional attachments? And they often do it by using a very emotionally loaded language. They swamp, drain the swamp, or people, hordes of migrants, so the language itself becomes very interesting or important, I think, in this metaphors.
I know we got a lot of other questions, so I'll just have a very brief response to that very good question. That'll be maybe the flip side to this, that ontological security and ontological security politics and devices can also be very, very important for remaking the ontology of your community. It can be very important for resistance. So if you think about the emotional life world that comes out of ontological security studies in terms of different emotions, it's not necessarily just anxiety, dread, fear. It's not always that we are vis-a-vis the state. It can also be solidarity. It can also be what Ty Solomon calls circulations of affect, the way in which resistance movements or transnational protest movements use chanting, right, and rituals and rhythms to be able to continue to go back out in the streets and try to remake the society that they see to be oppressive and closing down for who gets to be part of it. So that's important too. And I think that's the other way to think about it. Ontological security politics is about what is, right, and what could be. And if it's that way, then that reframes it in a way that it's not always about exclusion. It can be remaking who can be included as well.
Or narratives of hope rather than narratives
Narratives
of
of
fear.
hope.
You know.
And joy as
And joy,
resistance.
yeah.
An article that Alex Hall, who's sitting right in front of you, and I just published today, it just got published. We talk about that in the context of different emotions that get caught up in routines and rituals that can be protest as well.
We'll take a question up here, then we'll go over there.
Hello, my name is Ania, and I'm actually a criminology major. I'm also the president of the Sociology and Criminology Student Association, so social and behavioral sciences is my thing. I find it very interesting that you guys used some sort of analogies such as attachment and the longstanding conflict between states, and like we have to really figure out what that conflict, like what's keeping them there. And I guess my question for you guys is, how can we improve ontological security, and how can we continue implementing it globally and within our country?
You want me to go?
Yeah, I want to
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing, so I've had some graduate students who actually work on more just local politics and maybe weren't criminology majors but had experiences in law enforcement. And one of the things, again, one of the devices that we talk about in ontological security studies are routines and the way in which they pattern behavior. And in law enforcement, intelligence agencies, you hear the term, and bureaucratic agencies in governments, you hear the phrase of standard operating procedures, right? Or in the context of, you know, traffic stops and everything else, rules of engagement. And so providing ontological security to one entity may create ontological insecurity, maybe even physical insecurities to others. But if there's ways in which, as you're part of a community, in a criminology sense, you can reform those standard operating procedures so that they can be a little bit more inclusive and acknowledging, right? The importance of not just keeping one entity safe, but allowing for the de-escalation so that you still are enforcing law without necessarily creating even more insecurity. That would be one way in which you could see that at the local level that could be. So there is a lot of ontological insecurity and security when it comes to law enforcement and police reform as well, that you can definitely see if you just look at it a little bit more closely.
I just have a quick response. I mean, to me, I guess I'm such a structuralist in some sense that, you know, I mean, without addressing economic inequalities, racial inequalities, gender inequalities, I'm not sure you can, you know, you have to start. And it's not only about, you know, the emotions, it's also about the structures people live within and you know, have to, in some sense, cope with. So I think for me, those always go together, the structures of power and ontological security.
I'll just add quickly another structure, sort of physical structures of interaction is one thing I've been thinking about. So if you think about routines and what is the day-to-day life, what do you encounter? What do people encounter in their day-to-day life? What is, if a city is structured in a way that nobody ever that we're always encountering the same things and we only encounter the same kind of people, you are fostering and making it less possible to be able to be open to change, right? The structure, I mean, I'm reading Jane Jacobs and all the people who write about how do you structure physical living spaces and town centers in a way that can create a routine encounter with things that are very different, or a routine encounter of change, then you're really fostering structures of subjectivity that can withstand, you know, change.
All right, and due to time, we only have about one more question. We'll go over here.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. That was wonderful. Like we talked about this like remaking of what is, this hopefulness, and also our talk about just uncertainty in the world. You know, we live in a transnational, trans-state, intersectional, globalized world where routines just become more complex. So how fluid is the process between ontological security and insecurity across agents? Like, is it on a temporal scale? Is it on a spatial scale? Like, can somebody be go between ontological security and insecurity on a day basis or across routines? Like how fluid is that process, if that makes sense?
I mean, you can be insecure without being ontologically insecure. I'm insecure every day about so many different things. But I'm not ontologically insecure. Sometimes I could only really name it afterwards, because when you're in it, you're not really seeing it because you're ontologically insecure. So at the individual level, I guess I would say that, to begin with, the distinction between insecurity and identity insecurity, and deep ontological insecurity, where suddenly, one silly example I've given to students is, let's say you walk in and your mom doesn't recognize you as her kid anymore, and talks to you as if you're just a complete lack of understanding. The way that I felt with my grandma when she was deep in Alzheimer's, and we were very close. And so you walk in and suddenly they don't know you. That's actually a deeply unsettling, whatever they're going through, which is definitely comes first, but it's also deeply unsettling. If I know myself through my love for my grandma, that makes it a little bit hard for me for a while. So that distinction is important to me.
Very quickly, I mean, the only thing I'm thinking of is that sometimes we can have routines that actually generate the insecurity that they should be resolving. And a lot of times at the societal level, but even those of us at an individual level, we can have unhealthy routines that make us more insecure, but we just keep doing them because of an inertia, or going back to one of Professor Mitz's very first studies, habit. We can have really good habits, but we can have really bad ones too. And so that's where you're existing in both a security and insecurity maybe at the same time. That's what I was thinking of, Costa, to that very pointed, important question.
Yeah, I don't think I'm a match. I mean, I think you both. I'm thinking of, again, the kind of intersectionality of it all. I mean, that again, depending on where you are, you're more or less likely to be ontologically insecure. I think and that we can't think of ontological insecurity without thinking about how it intersects with economy, with other kind of power structure. So I guess the same response as before. That's how I see it.
All right, thank you all so much. That's all of our time today. Please thank the Policy Diplomacy Society, the Political Science Department, and as well as our guests for having them here. Thank you all so much.